Hi, welcome back to another video. We're going to talk about separating mixtures. So a mixture is something where you have constituents of different things mixed together. They can be homogeneous or heterogeneous, but we can separate mixtures physically and keep each component having its own identity. And there's different ways to do this and different ways to separate different mixtures. So one of my favorite is chromatography. You can actually separate a lot of things, such as dyes in ink can be separated by paper chromatography. There's liquid chromatography, there's gas chromatography, there's chromatography, thin layer chromatography, paper chromatography. There's a whole mess of them. But they can actually help you to separate a lot of different things. And what they do is they separate things based on their polarity. So what they do is they separate things based on their polarity. Another one is distillation. Distillation separates things based on the boiling points of each component in that mixture. And this would be an example of a laboratory distillation setup. Electrolysis, this is actually a type of separation, but it's actually a chemical process, not a physical separation. So it is used to separate things by chemical means. For example, you can separate water into hydrogen and oxygen. And so water becomes hydrogen and oxygen with a little bit of electricity put through them. You get to separate those. But this is not a physical separation. You're actually performing a chemical change here. So, separation techniques. Distillation is the separation by boiling point differences. Typically, a mixture is heated gradually, and the substance that vaporizes first and the easiest will separate out first, and you collect that by cooling it back down. Flotation is a method of separating solids by density differences. So you put them into water or some other sort of substance. Brine gets used a lot, and some will sink, others will float, and you can skim them off and separate them based on their density differences. Chromatography is separation by intermolecular attractions. So some mixtures have components that stick to a material and come out later, and so you can use chromatography to separate these, like with paper chromatography and dyes. Magnetism is another method of separation. You can pull certain substances that are attracted to a magnet, like iron scraps or iron filings, and you can pull them from that mixture. Filtration is separation by particle size. The particle size of substances can be very different, and passing them through a screen or a filter or something like that allow you to separate them out. Extraction is separation of liquids by density and solubility. Sometimes solids can be extracted from something else, and you can get dissolving them as a form of extraction, or extractions involved in that. So given enough time, you can separate these liquids from one another sometimes. Oil and water is probably the easiest example, and then remove them by a siphon or some other mechanical means like a separatory funnel. Crystallization is separation by solubility. Substances that have different solubilities, you can induce one to crystallize at a given temperature and form those crystals and then filter those out. And that's a crystallization purification step. Mechanical separation is by picking them apart and separating them by hand. Sometimes there's computers or robots that can be induced to do this. So, how are you going to separate it? Let me give you some examples, and you determine which one you would use to separate it. A mixture of rocks and sticks. So if I was going to do this, I would choose either mechanical separation or flotation. There are multiple answers for a lot of these. Alcohol and water. Alcohol and water, there are some methods of extraction that will work that involve salting out the alcohol, but really and truthfully, most of the times this is done by distillation. Mixture of PVC and polypropylene pellets. What you need to know about this is PVC sinks in water and polypropylene pellets will float. If you got flotation, you don't win a prize, but you got it right. Sand and rocks. Filtration. Filtration is your best bet with screens and things like that. This is how this is done commercially. Iodine and iron filings. Magnetism. Extraction will also work. There's also a way to do an extraction, but magnetism is your best bet. Salt and water. Distillation, evaporation, as well as chromatography. Red and blue food dye. chromatography is the obvious answer here, and I would argue is the best answer. Sugar and salt dissolved in water. So chromatography is a possibility, but if it was me, I would choose crystallization most likely. Sand and salt. Extraction. Salt dissolves in water, sand does not.